Thank you very much for joining us tonight, a snowy evening on Cape Cod. My name is Jen Cullum, and I work for Housing Assistance Corporation as the Director of Community Engagement and Advocacy. And together with our partners and friends, John Smolak and Rob Brennan, this time, we're going to start kind of double clicking on some of the biggest priorities that cities and towns seem to have. And the biggest questions and how to use these tools and how to avoid things turning bad in front of all of these new demands that we have for housing on Cape Cod. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Rob Brennan, who works for Smolak and Vaughn, and John Smolak himself, dear friends of HAC who've helped us in many ways. And I've made both of them co-hosts, I believe, because I'm told I have spotty Wi-Fi from all the snow outside. So if I sound wobbly, if someone could let me know, that would be fantastic. And so without further ado, I'll leave it to Rob and John. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jen, and thank everyone for turning out today on a very snowy day here on Cape Cod. I should have known that a day when there's really nothing else to do, it's going to drive turnout to hear about Chapter 40B. So I guess in this regard, the weather's working with us. I see a lot of names here of folks that are familiar. And a lot of names that I recognize. And it really seems like this is a great cross-section of both municipal leaders and housing advocates, local housing advocates across, looks like several towns, as well as, some folks that are actively engaged in the development of new housing, wearing many hats. And I know wearing many hats is something that we're all used to, particularly here on the Cape, and certainly has been the case for me. Real quick, I know many of you in some of the roles that I've played and continue to play as a member of the Barnstable County Economic Development Council. Working through what was my development company, Cape Built Development. We were one of the original partners with Housing to Protect Cape Cod. And I've had the opportunity to meet several of you at the housing summits that we've had over the past couple of years. For the past year plus, I have had the privilege to be back practicing law, which is what I originally went to school for and did for almost 15 years before doing some development work here in the Cape. And I joined up with a fantastic firm, Smolak and Vaughn, and my colleague, John Smolak, is joining me here today. So I'm going to turn this over to John to kick things off with some opening remarks about 40B and about the permitting process and different ways that what the statute provides and the regulations provide, paired with local options, can be leveraged in many ways in collaborative efforts. And there really is, I think, no one better in the state to talk about this. John has been, with having founded Smolak and Vaughn, we're going to be celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. And John, long before that, has been a leader in the real estate bar, developing not only residential, commercial, mixed use, and doing a lot of the hard work to put the tools in place at the State House. Including on Chapter 40R, which we really won't touch on today, but the offshoot of that, Chapter 40Y, that I'll be speaking to, along with the local preferences. So I guess with that introduction, it's my privilege to turn this over to my colleague, John Smolak.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Jen, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. And there is certainly a lot to cover, and we certainly can't get into all the details, but what we'd like to do is sort of provide you with some of the highlights in terms of Chapter 40B, and then some of the practical applications to Chapter 40B, and some of the misconceptions as well. And so as you see for the agenda, we're looking to sort of provide a very broad overview of Chapter 40B itself, and followed by a discussion related to Chapter 40B, and that's local preferences. And then, as Rob has indicated, a discussion about Chapter 40Y, which was enacted a year ago from last November, which is another offshoot that provides another opportunity for housing production in terms of starter homes, and then go into Q&A. And so I guess, just to start, our job is really to try to take away some of the mystery of 40B and try to identify some of the misconceptions out there about the law. And in its most simple terms, back in the late 60s, the Commonwealth was facing a housing crisis, but for different reasons. And that's when the legislature at that time was very proactive and took action to attempt to streamline and simplify the approval process to enable the production of affordable housing. And so the statute hasn't really changed since 1969, but the regulations implementing that statute have changed over the years based on different forces that came to be in terms of growing pains as Chapter 40B grew and evolved. And so, just a couple of highlights before we get to the next slide is that there's a common misconception out there that 40B is always combative, but in reality, it doesn't need to be a process full of conflict. And in fact, few developers, which we've represented on the development side, and in fact, most of them who've been through the 40B process on multiple occasions, almost universally feel that the best result in the 40B process, both for the developer and the town, comes from a collaboration with the town to get the best product that you can. However, what can happen sometimes, and you've heard the horror stories in some projects in the news, a developer without a lot of experience who hasn't been through the process can sometimes use the process as leverage or as a stick against the town in a hostile effort. And sometimes when the developer feels it didn't get a fair result from a project going through the normal permitting process under the state zoning laws and the state zoning bylaws, will then sometimes quickly turn around and threaten a Chapter 40B, and we'll discuss that a little bit further. On the other hand, sometimes when confronted with a 40B project for the first time, a municipality may have had a particularly bad experience with a 40B. In that circumstance, when a new project comes along, they might dig their heels in on a newly proposed project and might not have educated itself well enough to understand that a real collaborative process is possible. So a couple of circumstances where we've used 40B as really a planning tool is, for example, where a project site might be bisected by 2 or 3 different zoning districts, and 40B provides the applicant and developer and the municipality with some zoning flexibility, which is necessary to make a project lay out better for planning purposes. Or sometimes a municipality might be seeking to develop town-owned property and has a vision, and the best route, because of the existing zoning, might be to pursue a project under Chapter 40B, which again is designed to provide a more streamlined process through the Zoning Board of Appeals. And there's also a common misconception that 40B is under 40B that a developer holds all the straws and has all the leverage over the town, or that the town feels is powerless to help shape the project. But none of that is really an absolute or really borne out in the processes that we've been involved with. And you have to remember that for a developer, 2 things are most important. Number 1, time, and number 2, resources or money. And so as to time, the developer wants to get through the 40B process before the ZBA as efficiently as possible. And the longer the process takes, the more expensive it gets. So from a developer standpoint, the developer has every incentive in the world to work with the city or town. So just moving on briefly in terms of the stages of a 40B development. There really are generally 5 stages, and we won't be discussing all of them in detail, and maybe the only stage that we'll be discussing in detail this evening might be the comprehensive permit process itself. But in terms of the stages, quickly, the first stage is project eligibility. Every permit project must secure what's called the subsidy in the form of what is issued as a project eligibility letter from that subsidizing agency in order to be eligible to file an application for a comprehensive permit before the Zoning Board of Appeals. And the subsidy must be one on an approved list of federal, state, or other subsidies provided through the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, or EOHLC, or which is the former DHCD. Sorry for the acronyms, but and the common subsidies are the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston's New England Fund, or the Local Initiative Program, or the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, and there are dozens of others. But a developer must first apply for that subsidy and then must simultaneously copy the chief elected official on that application. So the time that a developer applies for that subsidy is really the first real public notice a developer provides to the town that a comprehensive permit might be coming. So the next stage is the comprehensive permit process, which we'll discuss in a little more detail. But once the project eligibility letter, or the PEL, is issued, the developer files the comp permit application, which we'll discuss shortly. Then once a comp permit decision is issued and it's final, the developer must request the subsidizing agency to issue what's called a letter of final approval, which is basically a confirmation that the proposed project that was originally approved as part of the project eligibility letter is generally consistent with the project that was approved by the ZBA. And that's a subsidizing agency process that happens again post-permit. And then beyond that, there are construction and occupancy restrictions, which are monitored by the subsidizing agency, and then the post-occupancy oversight, which is monitored by the subsidizing agency, which generally monitors the project to ensure that the affordability requirements are followed and maintained. And although there are 5 really stages in the process, there's a 6th stage of the process, which really occurs before a PEL application is submitted. And that process is making sure your town is ready for a 40B application. And what does this mean? Basically, the town should have already developed an affordable housing production plan, which identifies what its needs are, where and what suitable locations are in the town, and what type of housing, whether it's rental or ownership housing, that is really lacking within the town. Also, town should ensure that it's developed or formed a local housing partnership, because that's traditionally the first stop for a developer to meet with a group of pro-housing advocates, which is a local housing partnership. And has the town adopted an affordable housing trust? Typically, this is a trust that's created and funded through the town to assist with funding or subsidizing or otherwise financially supporting an affordable housing project. And then education, which is very important. You know, hopefully the town is, before it receives a comprehensive permit application, has developed workshops and educated both the town officials and the elected officials, as well as the public, on the need and desire for affordable housing and how the processes work. And again, it's all part of an educational process. So moving on to the next stop is safe harbors. So once the developer files a comprehensive permit, the town circulates copies of the application to the local boards and departments for review. The town has noticed public hearing within 30 days of the actual hearing date, and the ZBA is about to hold its first hearing. The town should determine whether any of the so-called safe harbors are triggered. And what a safe harbor is a threshold or other requirement that, if triggered, it allows the local zoning board of appeals to deny the comprehensive permit. And that safe harbor claim has to be asserted within 15 days after the public hearing is opened. And so there are 7 of these safe harbors. Some of them may be familiar to you, some of them may not be. In reality, most of them are never triggered, but it's always important to work with your local town council to determine whether any of these safe harbors apply. First of which is the 10% rule. So if a board wants to deny a comprehensive permit, it may do so if the municipality has reached a level where the municipality's low and moderate income housing units exceeds 10% of its total housing units. So basically, that's the 10% threshold that many people may be aware of. Even if a town does exceed its 10% threshold, it can entertain a comprehensive permit. So that's another important notion to realize. And the subsidizing housing inventory is something that's maintained at the state, and it lists the number of approved affordable units and identifies them as a percentage of the percentage of total housing units within the town. That's how they get to their percentage. Just quickly, the next is general land area rule, or sometimes called the GLAM rule. If the town's housing exists on sites comprising more than 1.5% of the total land area that's zoned residential, commercial, industrial, then the zoning board of appeals can attempt to claim a safe harbor. There's very detailed guidance that the state has on this rule. Generally, most of the time, it does not work, but it's out there available for municipalities. Next is the annual land area minimum, basically, which provides that if in any one calendar year there is constructed housing on sites comprising more than 3.3% of the city or town's land area, or 10 acres, whichever is larger, then the ZBA may look to try to deny a comprehensive permit on that basis. Again, it's very rarely triggered, and actually I've never seen it triggered for that basis. The next is recent progress, or the 2% rule, which means that if within the past 12 months, the town has created new affordable units equal to or greater than 2% of the total year-round housing units, it can deny the project. And that's a situation where you might have a small town with a large project that may have been proactive and developed and approved this large project. It gives the town basically a 12-month sort of respite from a 40B project if the zoning board of appeals wants to invoke that provision. The next is a large-scale project, which means that if a project before the ZBA is a project that exceeds the state's definition of what is a so-called large project under the 40B regs, then it can deny the project. So, for example, if a municipality has between 5,000 to 7,500 units in the latest census, and a developer proposes a project in excess of 250 units, then the ZBA could deny that project, or can ignore that and proceed through the review process and approve the project. The next is related applications. This is called sort of the 1-year cooling off period, because in the past, some developers who have gotten a bad result from a failed conventional project would then turn around and threaten to file a 40B project as a scare tactic. This is a situation where community, again, received another application to develop on the same site within the past 12 months. For example, the developer sought a special permit or a subdivision approval for a non-residential project or for a market rate housing project at the same site, and it got appealed or denied. The developer must wait 1 year before filing an application for a comprehensive permit. The only exception to that is if the original application that was filed included affordable units. And then lastly, planned production. Many municipalities have developed a housing plan production plan. As I mentioned earlier, it's one of those tools that's very helpful from an educational standpoint to determine where the town is in terms of its housing production and where its needs are greatest. But if a town has an approved housing production plan and the town meets its production goals of creating units equal to at least 0.5% of its year-round housing stock in any 1 year, the town may be able to deny that comprehensive permit for at least a year. So again, those are the 7 types of safe harbors out there. They are rarely triggered, but they can be triggered. But the municipality and others should be aware of that. And so, just moving on to the next slide. So, if you're not triggering a safe harbor, what that means is the ZBA is in the hearing process, the developer is in the hearing process, and you're continuing in that review process in the normal course. And as part of that, the applicant, as part of its application, which we'll discuss shortly, will have been requesting waivers from zoning and other local requirements in order to make the project work. And then the process, again, is designed to be a streamlined permitting process where the Zoning Board of Appeals can step into the shoes of other local permitting authorities and issue the local permits through what is called, as you know, a comprehensive permit. So if we move on to the next slide. So a lot of times, well, most times, a comprehensive permit includes a request of waivers of local requirements. And sometimes those lists are short, sometimes they could be 15 pages in length, depending on the situation. But basically, the comprehensive permit process, again, to facilitate housing production, allows for the developer to request the zoning board of appeals to approve waivers from zoning requirements, which could be dimensional requirements, from subdivision requirements, matters related to wetlands at the local bylaw level, if there's a local bylaw, or local board of health regulations, historic, and also more importantly for Cape Cod is the Cape Cod Commission review. And so it's important to distinguish between the waivers from local requirements from state requirements, so that basically you can, an applicant can request a waiver from local wetlands bylaw or local board of health regulations, but the developer must comply with the State Wetlands Protection Act and the state Title V regulations if you're dealing with the Title V system, septic system. So that's important to understand. And basically, the waivers are reviewed generally at the end of the process after the peer review has been completed. And what you're trying to do is fine tune the project. And what you're doing is sort of identifying the list of waivers that would be necessary to be granted by the zoning board of appeals. Otherwise, if the waivers aren't granted, it could render the project uneconomic, which we can discuss later. So that's the waiver process. And again, sort of backing up a little bit, what is affordable housing under Chapter 40B? There are certain guidelines which make housing affordable. And when housing is identified as affordable housing, it's counted on the state's subsidized housing inventory for each town, which is related to the 10% threshold we talked about before. Affordable housing means that 25, for 40B purposes, means 25% of the units are affordable to households with incomes at or below 80% of the area median income, and that's the minimum requirement. An applicant can always look and propose a deeper subsidy, or could always propose more units to be affordable. But typically, a developer will not do that unless they have a subsidy which requires it, such as the federal low-income housing tax credit, which provides for a much deeper subsidy. And so it's also important to note that with respect to affordable units, if the project is a rental project and you meet the 25% at 80% threshold discussed above, all of those units count towards the town's subsidized housing inventory. And if it's an ownership unit, only those affordable ownership units count towards the inventory. And again, those units to be affordable have to be subject to a long-term affordability restriction. So moving on to the next item, this is just an example of the income limits that are set for Barnstable County. And so the far column to the right is the 80% AMI threshold. And the far column to the left is the household size. So affordability is determined by this formula developed by HUD, and those income limits are established every single year by HUD, and they do change and fluctuate. So moving on to the next, in terms of, as I mentioned before, in terms of the comprehensive permit, the scope of it, the Board of Appeals has jurisdiction over all what would otherwise be other approvals by other local boards or departments, which is such as zoning, subdivision control, wetlands, historic districts, scenic roads. And again, those waivers are necessary, must be necessary to allow for the construction of the proposed development. And moving beyond that, in terms of, there are some items that are within the purview of the Zoning Board of Appeals and some not. It's important to note that because this is a housing production statute, the Housing Appeals Committee and the case law related to the Housing Appeals Committee, which is the party that entertains appeals from a developer's from a denial or an approval with adverse conditions. But basically, you can't really require that school impacts be considered, school financial impacts, or impacts on the municipality, like such as water and sewer, except to the extent that a water or sewer line is impacted by the project specifically. So in other words, 40B can't be used by the Board of Appeals as a tool to cure long-term deferred maintenance and capital improvements that would be needed to be undertaken, whether or not the project was going forward or not. Also, what we typically see is a request for a fiscal impact study. That is not appropriate under 40B, and it's actually frowned upon. We also hear sometimes a request of how many school children would be generated by the project. And again, that's not something that is jurisdictional under the 40B review process, but it is an important factor to a municipality, and it does have a fiscal impact. So it doesn't mean that the zoning board of appeals can't ask, for example, the school superintendent to identify what impacts might be arising from school children that might be entering as a result of this project. But again, it's not to be considered as part of the review process. Some things are within the entire purview of the subsidizing agency. For example, home buyer selection or tenant selection. There's a affirmative fair housing marketing plan that is developed by the developer, but that's reviewed and approved by the state subsidizing agency. Also, profit monitoring and whether the project is feasible. Those are all determinations made by the subsidizing agency and can't be made by the local zoning board of appeals. If we can move on to the next scope, this slide. This is just a hitting upon the highlights of what's required for comp permit application. And these are generally the three or four main requirements. The applicant has to be either a public agency or a nonprofit or what's called a limited dividend organization. And what a limited dividend organization is, it's basically a private developer who agrees to limit its profit to that required by the subsidy. And so also there's a need to provide evidence of site control through a purchase agreement or an option agreement to show that you have control of the site that the developer is seeking to develop. And then there's a project eligibility from the subsidizing agency, which we discussed previously. And by the time that project eligibility letter is issued, the subsidizing agency will have already reviewed the project in terms of its financial feasibility and its appropriateness for the site. That also that the project is eligible for a subsidy. Moving on to the other submission requirements. These are additional requirements, minimum requirements for a comprehensive permit. Each city and town is different as to what they may require, but the regulations under 760 CMR 56, which are the 40B regulations, outlines these general requirements for submission for a complete application to be submitted to the Zoning Board of Appeals, which includes an existing conditions plan with a locus map, scaled architectural drawings, all of which are stamped by a professional engineer or architect, a tabulation of the proposed buildings, type, size, and ground coverage, a preliminary utilities plan, landscaping plan, and the list of requested waivers. And typically what we almost always see is a stormwater management report, or at least a preliminary determination of stormwater management, and then also a traffic report. And so those are generally the generally accepted types of materials that are submitted as part of the application process itself. Sometimes a developer who might think there may be a lot of changes may decide to provide sort of more towards the minimum level of what's required. But if there's been dialogue before a filing has been made, which is always helpful for staff to have that dialogue, then there may be more predictability as to what's expected through the review process, and in which case the developer may provide more information at the initial stages. If we can go to the next slide. This is sort of like a timeout for the critical dates and timeframes in the 40B process, which really need to be followed very closely. These timeframes are usually handled by staff, and I'll go through just a couple of them very quickly. So that basically once a comp permit is filed, no later than 7 days from the date which the application is received, the application is supposed to be distributed to the various boards and municipal departments for and to request their comments. 14 days before the public hearing date, notice must be published of a public hearing, which is similar to what same public hearing requirements for a conventional project under conventional zoning. Upon receipt of the comprehensive permit, the public hearing must be held within 30 days from the date of receipt of the application. Otherwise, it could be constructively improved. So it's a very important date to hit. Skipping beyond the other timeframes which deal with the safe harbors we discussed, there's the 180-day period. Because of the concerns of the state as to the timeliness of the review process and in the interest of trying to create an expedited review process, the state has set a time frame of 180 days for review of a project. So 180 days for the public hearing process. Sometimes those dates are extended, but that's usually a circumstance where you're close to being finished. But that is that does happen once in a while, where both parties, both the developer and the applicant, agree to extend that 180-day period. So it's important at the very beginning to get your peer review done or established at the very beginning, so you don't run into a rush at the end of the 180-day period. After the close of the hearing, the ZBA has 40 days to issue the permit decision and file it with the town clerk, and then that starts the 20-day appeal period in that process. So again, those are the critical timeframes which staff has to be really on top of with assistance with town council. Moving on quickly, because I'm taking up a lot of time here, just quickly, making an informed decision. Basically, it's very important for the Board of Appeals and the review process and staff to really focus on the major issues, which might be traffic, whether there's a signal needed, or whether there are real deficiencies in a sewer line, or difficulties in siting a septic system. Those issues should be fleshed out at the very beginning of the process, within the first hearing or two, so that it'll then enable the zoning board of appeals to sort of identify what it needs for peer review. And it's important to start that peer review early in order to stay within that 180-day period. And then a zoning board of appeals should always never be shy about requesting additional information from the applicant and to ask for additional graphics. So for example, if there's a concern about massing, it's not unusual for the developer's architect to put together a model or elevations to show what the massing of the project is compared to the surrounding neighborhood. So those are all important factors to consider. If we could move on to the next slide. And again, retaining peer review consultants, as I've stressed, it's really important to identify what is needed by the Zoning Board of Appeals to adequately review a project. And it's also important that at the time the project eligibility letter is issued, a town has the ability to request funds through MHP or Mass Housing Partnership to retain a consultant to work for the Zoning Board of Appeals to assist it to run through the process. And that consultant could be a planner, could be an attorney, or it could be an engineer. And then all those written reports that are developed for peer review are obviously part of the record. And what we also tend to do is try to encourage there to be subcommittee meetings outside of the normal hearing process to allow the developers, engineers, and the town's peer review consultants to collaborate and to more easily identify remaining and outstanding issues, which would then be brought back to the Zoning Board of Appeals for the record. Go on to the next slide. And again, the whole idea is to balance the regional housing needs with local concerns. And the local concerns are outlined there in front of you: health, safety, environmental, open space, and planning are the major local concerns which are difficult to overcome in terms of overturning a decision actually in the event that the Zoning Board of Appeals is looking to deny a project. It's a very difficult threshold for the Zoning Board of Appeals to overcome, particularly if their housing is less than 10%. Next is the the decision. Once the decision is issued, if it's a denial, or if there are conditions which the developer cannot live with, then the appeal can go to the Housing Appeals Committee, which is the state appeals committee that makes a decision at the state level. If it's approved and a butter looks to deny, that also has to be appealed within 20 days, but that appeal is to the Superior Court or Land Court. So that is generally the appeals process. If we can go to the next slide. And again, just summarizing, the hearing must be closed within 100 days of opening the public hearing, decision issued within 40 days, and appeal within 20 days of the filing of the decision. So, and next slide. And again, what we've discussed the appeal routes that are available to the Housing Appeals Committee or to the Superior Court or Land Court. And in the interest of time, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Rob Brennan.
Thanks, John. Jen mentioned at the beginning, kind of coming into this, that there was a session earlier today, and we understand the interest, on local preference. And I think, again, in the abstract, it's something that I think is often not appreciated by municipalities. That, again, in the collaborative vein of a 40B, working developer, and the municipality and other local housing interests, it does create the opportunity to really target where the development is, going to be marketed, and what the selection, process would be, giving additional weight, again, subject, to approval, by the subsidizing agency, of the manner and the weight that's given to local residences and others with connections to the community. Step through this. DHCD, which is now EOHLC policies, identify generally 4 categories that local preference can be given to in the lottery process for the initial populating of the affordable units. And those include current residents of the municipality, folks that are living in the community at the time of the lottery. They must be current residents, not former. So, folks who grew up, moved away, want to come back in, are not captured by that preference. Municipal employees, I know a significant concern here. We've all heard the stories, about the municipalities being unable or finding challenges in hiring employees, including first responders, because of the lack of affordable housing, here throughout the Cape. Employees of local businesses, that are located within the municipality. Then households with children attending the community schools. And that, would include families that might be living, outside, but because of, the district schooling that we have and school choice throughout the Commonwealth, families living in one town whose children may be attending community schools in another. And a fifth one that I don't think is firmly reflected in EOHLC policies, but has been a preference that has been approved for other projects is veterans as well. So again, all of these subject, to approval. The one thing that can't be imposed is a minimum period of time. Can't say that folks who have been living here, for a year, for 2 years, for more. The operative period of time is where they are living at the time of the residents at the time of the lottery for the initial occupancy. Again, that's filling up that portion of affordable units within a project, which functions, as an actual lottery. And if anyone here knows folks, that have been selected through that, it really is like hitting the lottery for a lot of families, being able on a rental or ownership basis to be able to qualify, renting units at, discounted rates from market, or to be able to purchase as well. So, but again, just the operative time is solely the time of the lottery. Burden being on the community to meet three criteria. The first is that there's a documented need for the local preference. And again, this can be satisfied, as examples say, local residents on a waiting list for subsidized rental, or other documented cases, be it in a housing production plan. And this is not linked to a housing production plan, but there's a need for the municipality to document why that local preference is needed. All of this being reviewed and approved by the subsidizing agency. And that the proposed percentage of the local preference units is reasonable. And again, based on case law and practice, it's a 70% cap. 70% of the affordable units is what is considered kind of an upper limit on the local preferences. So not being able to set aside all of the affordable units, but being able to, and again, not set aside, but provide a preference that can operate in several forms, including how it's marketed, and how lottery entries may be weighted. And the third being that the preference will not have a disparate impact on federal fair housing. Not something that comes up very often, but kind of a theoretical example could be if you have a community with a very low minority population, then that could be seen as having a disparate impact if you're setting aside 70% of the units, or having a local preference for folks who reside in that community, if that community's population is disproportionate. The ZBA, often in considering local preferences, works hand in hand with local housing partnerships or housing trusts that are on the ground administering local housing, and have both a grasp of the need, who's on the waiting list. And the final point, just with regard to these thresholds and requirements, is that they, in the context of a decision, they ought to be qualified as being included in the decision to the extent permitted under applicable law, and then again subject to review by the subsidizing agency. So that is local preference. And again, John and I will be fielding questions on this, and I know we have a number of other experts in this field that I see have joined as well. So I look forward to having some good questions. 40Y is something that is new, and Jen asked us to touch on this. Both John and I have been involved in the development of this. The inclusion of 40Y is really kind of an extraction of 40Y from something that was previously on the books in the form of Chapter 40R. And its goal is the promotion, of single-family starter homes, developing another piece in the missing middle, but particularly for ownership, allowing folks to kind of get off of that hamster wheel of rental and onto a newly created lower rung in towns that opt into and adopt a 40Y bylaw. So kind of creating a new opportunity, for starter homes that, because of the caps on size and on lot size and both and home size, that naturally, within a municipality would fall at a lower point than homes on acre lots or more. And again, adopted in 2022 November, so still relatively new, and the regulations are still being developed. Previously, and this says previously was an option under Chapter 40Y. It actually should read previously was an option under Chapter 40R, which was the Commonwealth Smart Growth Statute. The requirement previously was that these zoning overlays creating a 40R district be located with a smart growth tie-in, which most often meant having some location to public transit. When you're talking about locating an overlay or locating a project in proximity to public transit, most often what that meant was the price of the land was such so that projects would only pencil out if you went vertical on them, meaning multifamily, and not being able to create single family starter homes in proximity to high value rapid transit line. So in the entire course of the 40R program, which is ongoing today, exactly 0 units were created, single family units, which is why it was extracted and put in a standalone with 40R, under 40Y. And one major thing that was stripped out was there's no longer a requirement for a smart growth nexus, which means municipalities can adopt a 40Y overlay in any area of town, that's appropriate. There was also under 40R, a minimum land area size, and that has also been stripped away. So 40Y can be used for both, larger neighborhoods, creating, these starter home neighborhoods, or also, for smaller infill projects that would have been below 40R threshold. Some major highlights of the legislation: it's adopted as a local bylaw, requiring a simple majority vote. Again, because it was adopted on the heels of the housing choice legislation, which lowered the voting threshold for both special permits and for bylaw amendments that were creating housing. This expressly, was designated and benefits from the simple majority requirement, as opposed to the prior 2/3 or supermajority requirement for changing zoning bylaws. Another significant highlight is that the towns and municipalities receive a payment or multiple payments from the state. So there is a financial incentive and a financial benefit to municipalities to create these starter home districts. And that takes 2 different forms. One is that a municipality receives a payment from the Commonwealth based on the projected yield, the theoretical yield of the district, based on the bylaw, and then for every actual building permit that is issued by the town gets an additional payment. Currently, that payment is at $3,000 per building permit. There is, some proposed legislation to change the calculus for both that and the payments on the theoretical yield. So when you're creating one of these 40Y districts, the bylaw tracking, the provisions of the statute is to create as of right development at a density of not fewer than 4 units per acre. So again, if you're, going to be doing an overlay that would cover, say, 10 acres, it has to be at least, 4 units per acre of the developable land, which excludes, wetlands and some other, undevelopable land. But then that developable land yield has to be at least 4 units per acre. That 4 units per acre is a basement. It's not a ceiling. Most often, getting that number from 4 units to acre, whether it approaches, 6, 8, we've seen proposals for as much as 10. Really, that becomes a function practically of what your wastewater situation is, whether this is a neighborhood that would be on sewer, or whether you would be having to provide for for Title V systems. The bylaw, in addition to allowing at least 4 units per acre, and just to drop a footnote here. Actually, I'm sorry, I think it's actually shown. The starter homes are defined, or it's not shown here. Sorry, starter homes defined as no more than 1,850 square feet. That's one provision of the statute that we left out here. But the definition of starter home, again, up to a 1,850 square foot home. But in addition to the home, the bylaw may, but is not required to permit construction of an accessory dwelling unit of not more than 600 square feet on the same lot as the starter home. So again, density of at least 4 dwelling units per acre. Those dwelling units can be up to 1,850 square feet plus an additional 600 square feet for an accessory dwelling unit. The districts per statute are directed to incorporate certain sustainable development practices for all starter homes that are built. At least 50% of the homes in a district are required to contain at least 3 bedrooms. And the affordability requirement for projects that are 12 homes or more, or that could accommodate 12 units or more, is 10% of the units being affordable at 110% of the area median income. And again, I think the recognition there in building single family homes, that is, a higher cost burden. So also, ownership, being, something that's much more achievable, and being able to populate the, the lottery by raising, those income levels into 110% of area median income. Some other things worth noting, per statute, the district would not be subject and cannot be subject to any limitations or building moratoria that are adopted. And also, like 40B, municipality is prohibited from imposing additional environmental health ordinances that exceed state requirements that would, because of that delta or, the degree of exceedance, render development infeasible. And again, we expect that when the regulations are written, those provisions are largely expected to track the 40B regs. An issue that's worth mentioning here, and certainly not, one that is necessarily impacted or of concern from communities off Cape, but as the legislation stands now, there's a provision that says the bylaw shall now not impose any restrictions on age or any other occupancy restrictions on the district as a whole or any portion. And I think what that was intended for was, for municipalities not to say, okay, if you're going to do it, it can only be senior housing, which would be an obvious, age restriction. The immediate concern, here on Cape Cod, as we're reading this, and as many of you who have looked at it and as you're hearing this, may have heard, is with the intention of this statute, being to address that missing middle, workforce housing, and to bring, ownership, into reach of folks who right now, despite their earnings, being there, they're simply competing in a market against folks who are buying their second and third homes. And that saying about bringing a knife to a gunfight. So the obvious concern is, that this can be a tool that can be used by municipalities, throughout our region to specifically target, those, local employees, those local families that intend and are in, dire need of a home, for their year-round occupancy, and not just bringing, more cottage scale homes to market where second home, buyers will, be able to most times, outcompete, working families here on the Cape. So there is, a proposed amendment that we have been working with. And when I say we, Housing to Protect Cape Cod, and many of you here who have voiced that same concern, working with our local delegation to get that amendment made to the statute, so that municipalities in enacting as or adopting a 40Y district can include that year-round restriction. Another provision, finally, is that districts need to comply with federal and state fair housing laws. I mentioned the proposed amendment to allow year-round residency restrictions. With regard to where it stands now, the statute, has been on the books for a little bit of time now. There has been a working group, within EOHLC working on these, regulations. There's been, I know, participation, by several municipal leaders and stakeholders here throughout the region, and they anticipate final regulations, to be promulgated by this coming fall. That'll include, a lot of, the additional definitions. Again, as I mentioned, expected to incorporate provisions, from the 40B and 40R regulations, the mechanics, of submitting, proposed districts to EOHLC for review, how payments are made. But despite, the regulations lagging a little bit, Secretary Augustus on multiple occasions, including in speaking at the last HPCC Housing Summit this fall, voiced his commitment to pilot programs, including any opportunities that might be identified, by a municipality here on the Cape looking to bring a zoning bylaw forward. How that we expect would work, and what's been explained to us is that, the guidance would be what's in the statute, kind of following, those bullet points that we mentioned, and that the regulations, when adopted, would have a backward-looking provision and make those payments to any municipalities, both for adoption of the district and issuance of any permits that followed the statutory provisions in advance of the regulations. So that I think throws open a significant door here on the Cape for community or communities that wanted to move forward, perhaps that had a site right now that might be under municipal control, whether that's an abandoned school site or other surplus municipal land, to adopt a bylaw, put out a project for RFP, and then try to bring some of these missing middle ownership opportunities that were intended by 40Y on board. So that is our overview of 40B and 40Y. John and I would be happy to take any conversations or any questions, and we hope that maybe this will identify some areas of interest that we can have HPCC drill into in more depth. But really wanted to provide an overview of the 40B 40Y process and look at that local preference.
So there's actually a few questions, if I can just interrupt briefly, that have been posed in the Q&A and in the chat. I don't know if maybe we want to take a shot at those. I think there was one for John, maybe in the Q&A. Does 40B apply to the development process and the process of choosing who gets to live there? This is from an anonymous participant. And are these separate applications? If they are separate, who dictates the lottery selection?
Okay.
That was one.
Well, there are two aspects to that. During the 40B process, the Zoning Board of Appeals will frequently identify what might be preferred local preference categories, but those are typically proposed because of the fact that the state subsidizing agency has the final approval of those preference categories, if in fact they are permitted. The subsidizing agency determines whether a local preference is permitted based on detailed guidance that they have. And basically, depending on the subsidizing agency, it could be the subsidizing agency that monitors the lottery, or it could be the subsidizing agency that assists in implementing the lottery. But invariably, the affordability and fair housing marketing plan that's put together that outlines what the lottery will include is put together by the developer's consultant and approved by the state subsidizing agency.
Great. And then shall I read the one from the chat too? I don't know if you're interested in this one. These are both, I think, go to 40B or 40Y rather, from Sade Ratcliffe, who works at CHAPA. She's a great woman who came down and helped us in Dennis the other day do a community meeting. Asks, does local preference not act as a tool to prevent the imbalance in the buyer's market? And if not, can you talk a bit more about why some specific local legislation might do a better job?
So I guess I'm trying to answer your question. Does it not act as a imbalance in the buyer's market? I guess if you're looking at a buyer's market and saying you're going to be weighting it to folks within a municipality, I think that's a fair point. I think it is kind of a balancing that they tried to strike in implementing and allowing the local preference between a community trying to direct and meet needs that exist and might be unique to a municipality. And I certainly do think that local legislation and things tailored and adopted locally could be a better approach to this. I don't think anyone suggests that the 40B process including local preferences is perfect. I think far from that. And I think what is important is that municipalities continue the process of looking at what their local situation is, what historically has been developed, where the needs exist, where the unmet needs are, and how the municipality can better meet that. One thing obviously we didn't touch on here is the ability through the local initiative program for local affordable housing bylaws to generate units that are then counted to benefit the municipality's subsidized housing inventory. I know that the town of Dennis, where I did some work, had some great success under their local affordable housing bylaw, and having that be a locally driven process with a state subsidy, but having that be more locally tailored. And I think many examples exist. Dennis is the one that I'm most familiar with.
What I
Excellent.
would also just add just quickly is, in terms of local preference, the municipality has to make a demonstration that there's a need for local preference. On the other hand, we've represented 40B developers in situations where the town didn't desire to have a local preference and let the market forces dictate it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. There's one other question here that's from Maggie Spade, who actually used to work at HAC and now is the housing coordinator in Dennis. You were just talking about Dennis. Her question is the proposed year-round restriction for the 10% deed restricted units? Is it only for the 10% deed restricted?
No, it would not be only for the 10% deed restricted units. My understanding that as drafted, it would apply to all units and not just the 10%. Again, the goal of 40Y, being to fill that missing middle, and particularly fill that missing middle with an ownership opportunity. And I think, again, without that year-round restriction in a place like Cape Cod, you start putting these 1,850 square foot homes, at least half of which have to be 3 bedrooms. You, without that, I think would be putting some very attractive homes and ownership opportunities into the second home market. So that obviously I think is not the intention, looking at it through a lens and trying to meet the housing needs here. So no, that would allow municipalities to put that restriction on all units, not just the affordables.
I'm just going to ask anyone else who's there's 25 people still in the room. If there's an interest in a question, you can put it in the chat and we can answer it there. I did want to ask something that I didn't ask you guys to prepare for. Oh, and here's Matt Levesque, my friend, asking a similar question. With the Riverview School announcement today, would the Dover Amendment in Chapter 40A apply? I know it's off script because I asked you guys for 40B and 40Y, but we had the announcement for the Riverview School today at 35 Scudder, and we're all very excited about that and wondering how that would pan out. Do you have any comments?
John, you want to field this?
Well, I don't know the specifics of the proposal, but understand generally about it. But my understanding, if it is a school, an educational facility, it could propose that it be approved under the Dover Amendment.
And with that too, the case law under the Dover Amendment, it expands a little bit, the what could be included within that. So I think it also, probably opens the opportunity not just for strictly academic buildings, but obviously, those of us familiar with Riverview, know that it's a residential school. So, I think an obvious second, step would be, to include, the housing, for students. And then I think also probably, could create an opportunity, for housing for staff, as well. I think, again, you look back to, the nexus between, any ancillary, uses and, what the primary, purpose is. And I know that, that educational hook, provides, a very solid, anchor, that does generally, under the case law, allow for, the inclusion of housing that has a nexus to that, primary educational purpose.
I have a question, since I'm waiting for more to come into the chat. The 40B also has a home ownership side to it. Is that correct? And could you comment on that a little bit? Because we talked about 40Y just to see what the by right 40B one is.
Correct. So it does. The statute itself, does not dictate, one form, or the other. In the regulations, as as John touched on, it does treat the units that get counted towards the municipality's subsidized housing inventory, a little bit differently. As you remember, John's slide talking about in a rental situation, if at least 25% of the total units are deed restricted as as affordable, then 100%, all of the rental units, both those capital A affordable, and those that are market, get counted toward the state's or the municipality's subsidized housing inventory. On an ownership, right? So if you to take the same multifamily building, but it wasn't rental, and now it was a condominium. Only those units, that are restricted as affordable are counted. Even if it's the same number out of a 100-unit project, it's the same, 25 units. Only those 25 units that are actually designated as affordable count toward the subsidized housing inventory. But same, income provisions, govern, just as, from the, qualifying incomes, you kind of back into what is, allowed in terms of rent. You do the same, in an ownership. You basically take what the qualifying income is, figuring in, taxes, insurance, looking at, mortgage rates, and you effectively back into what can be supported in terms of a purchase price by, a family, qualifying at, the stated income, again, if it's at 80, 80% of AMI. So there is, a calculus that, that applies. And there, it's even more, like hitting the lottery. Again, if you can imagine a family, that is selected and has the opportunity to buy, purchase a home, at a number that is at a price that's, significantly discounted from what that might fetch, on the market, particularly, here on the Cape.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm waiting to have more questions come in the chat, but I think you guys answered everything. No one has any questions. They're all waiting for beef stew that they've had in the crock pot all day, probably at this point with the storm. Do you have anything else you'd like to add? Is there anything that we maybe should have asked that we didn't, that you were expecting?
I think there's one thing I would add. There is a significant opportunity for the Cape in the Affordable Homes Act, the housing bond bill that the Haley Driscoll administration, filed. One of the provisions in there is, a seasonal communities designation. And this is something that, Elisa Magnotta and I, brought up to Governor Baker and Lieutenant Governor Polito and Secretary Keneally, a few years ago. It was obviously still part of the Baker-Polito administration at a housing event in Falmouth. And that was, recognition that, the Cape, as well as, the Berkshires, where folks also, buy and compete for second homes, are very different markets than are experienced by, the rest of Massachusetts because of that second home, competition. And that as a result, we really need some additional tools to be put on the table. And, the housing bond bill included a seasonal communities designation. Between now and, the end of July, when we expect, kind of coming down to the wire, that the bond bill will be adopted. Filling out, what that seasonal communities designation means is, kind of to be written in the legislature. So I would urge folks, to contact, their reps, contact, Julian Sear, Sue Moran, and, express, your ideas and, and interests and concerns for getting some additional tools on the table. One that I'll mention, because it does tie in, with kind of what we're talking about in missing middle and affordable ownership, is a program called Commonwealth Builder. And that is, a program that, provides cost subsidies, to facilitate the construction of ownership projects, affordable ownership projects. And those can go up to, I believe, 110 or 120% of AMI. I forget which number it is. And it provides one subsidy kind of up to 100% of AMI and another subsidy beyond. So it brings those ownership opportunities, again, down into an affordable range. Again, whether it's going to be 80, 100, 110% of AMI. And significantly and different from 40B ownership, where you have deed restrictions and affordability restrictions that that continue long term. This is a program that allows families to buy in at a discounted price, to stay in a community, to put down roots, and to start building equity as the affordability restriction burns off over time. So again, it's intended to attract folks to buy into, to stay in a community, and in return for that allows them to accumulate wealth, being able the longer they stay in, to be able to sell at a higher point than they bought into. And again, that restriction burns off in steps over time. Ultimately, if families stay there for the upper limit, the affordability component burns off entirely. So just as the time perhaps that kids are heading off to college, families will be able to to access equity that they built up in the home, whether it's a result of of home equity loans, or selling and realizing the equity and moving. So that's an important and exciting tool that exists now in Barnstable, because it's a program that currently exists for gateway cities, and Barnstable is considered a gateway city within the state. But the idea of bringing a program like Commonwealth Builder and others across all of the Cape and Islands is I think is a very kind of exciting but perhaps underappreciated component of the Affordable Homes Act that's pending.
So, one reason why I wanted to do these seminars, and thank you guys so much for coming tonight, is because in my travels around the Cape, I've seen so many questions come from people who sit on boards and committees. And, the material is dense and complicated a lot of the times. And so what happens is, and I say this because I recently ran for school committee and have to now take an 8-hour training course to sit on the school committee after having spent 12 years on the town council in Barnstable. When you get elected as an elected official or appointed to a board and committee, you don't sit through any seminars to help you find the four corners of your charge. And so I think it's really important that we continue to talk about these things, because although 40B can be really terrifying for citizens and communities, it can also be a tool with which we can help alleviate the housing crisis. And there's so many things like we spoke of tonight, like the 40Y, the 40B home opportunity, that also kind of meet the moment on other things like the generational wealth issue that we have, and the home ownership issue that we have, and the gap between renters and how hard it is now to buy a home. So thank you guys so much for touching on all these things. I do see one more thing that's in the chat here. I think that's it. Maybe a Q&A. No, that's it. So I want to thank you both for taking this really snowy afternoon, getting us past, as my father would say, sun's over the yard arm now, so we can all go home and enjoy, and then back to school and work tomorrow, right? So I want to thank you very much for everything you've done, and don't be surprised if there's a few stragglers that actually do email you to ask specific questions.
Thank you, Jen. And we're happy to, and I, John and I did notice, kind of we're joined here today, by another expert. I mean, again, several folks, but Judy Barrett, we talked about, kind of outside experts. She is one that often works with, with municipalities. She, does a great job, educating municipalities, educating, attorneys, and, several of the, slides and information, that we compiled together, we drew from materials that, that Judy had posted. So want to both, thank and recognize her, among those experts that municipalities, can and do turn to, for guidance. So, it really was, very much, with both the municipal folks and folks like Judy who joined, kind of an all-star audience today. And, we look forward to all of us, helping to move, housing here on the Cape forward. And we certainly would be happy to, to return at any time.
Thank you very much for that. Don't be surprised if we have you back for the Dover Amendment in a couple of months. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you next month for form-based code, I hope. More exciting stuff. Thank you. Have a great night. Appreciate it.